Summer 1942. The Eastern Front stretched across 1,000 miles of burning villages and shattered earth. In the darkness above Stalingrad, German soldiers began reporting something impossible. The sound of broomsticks sweeping through the night sky, followed by silence, then explosions that tore through ammunition depots and supply lines. The Luftwaffe called them Nachthexen, night witches. They were women barely old enough to vote, flying canvas and plywood biplanes built before most of them were born, and they would become one of the war's most feared bomber units. Before we continue, subscribe and turn on the bell. Here we tell real, untold stories of World War II, stories of courage, sacrifice, and the price women paid to defend their homeland in an age that told them war belonged only to men. This is not a story of triumph. It is a story of young women who stepped into cockpits knowing they might not return, who flew through searchlight beams and anti-aircraft fire with engines that barely reached highway speeds, and who watched friends fall from burning planes into frozen fields below. The German military machine awarded its highest decorations to pilots who shot them down. Soviet propaganda celebrated them as heroes. But inside the wooden barracks where they slept between missions, they were simply daughters, sisters, and friends trying to survive one more night. What the Luftwaffe never understood was that these women had already learned how to disappear. Soviet society had taught them to be invisible. Mechanics denied pilot training. Students rejected from aviation schools. Volunteers turned away from recruitment centers because war was no place for women. When they finally earned the right to fly, they discovered that invisibility could become a weapon. In darkness, stripped of rank and recognition, they became ghosts that German radar couldn't track and searchlights couldn't hold. They flew low, cut their engines, and glided toward targets in silence broken only by wind through their wing struts. The sound that terrified soldiers called the whisper of witches' brooms. By war's end, over 30 of them would be dead. Many more would carry shrapnel in their bodies for the rest of their lives. Some would return home to find their families gone, their cities erased, their sacrifices forgotten by a peacetime world that wanted women back in factories and kitchens. This is their story, not of glory, but of the unbearable cost of being allowed to fight for a country that had never quite believed they belonged in the sky. Chapter 1. The sound of engines they were never supposed to hear. The biplanes were older than the war itself. Designed in 1928 for crop dusting and mail delivery, the Po-2 aircraft could barely reach 90 miles per hour in level flight. Its open cockpit exposed pilots to temperatures that dropped to 40 degrees below zero. Its canvas skin could be punctured by a well-aimed rifle bullet. It carried no radios, no defensive weapons, and no parachutes. The planes flew too low and too slow for parachutes to deploy before impact. When Soviet military planners looked at these obsolete trainers stacked in forgotten hangars across the country, they saw useless relics from a gentler age. When 3 young women stood before those same aircraft in October 1941, they saw their only chance to fly. Marina Raskova had been the Soviet Union's most celebrated aviator before the war, a navigator who had set long-distance records and become the first woman to teach at the Zhukovsky Air Force Academy. When Germany invaded in June 1941, she received thousands of letters from women demanding the right to fight. The military high command dismissed them. Women could serve as nurses, radio operators, or factory workers, but combat aviation required strength, discipline, and nerves that Soviet doctrine insisted only men possessed. Raskova went over their heads. She personally petitioned Stalin for permission to form 3 all-female aviation regiments. In a decision that surprised even his closest advisors, he agreed. The women who reported to Engels Air Base that autumn came from every corner of the crumbling Soviet empire. University students interrupted their studies. Factory workers abandoned their shifts. School teachers left their classrooms. Some were barely 17. Many had never seen an airplane up close. They arrived expecting modern bombers, synchronized formations, and the respect accorded to male combat units. Instead, they found ancient biplanes, second-hand uniforms cut for men 3 sizes larger, and boots so oversized they stuffed them with newspaper and rags to keep them from falling off mid-flight. Their male counterparts called them little sisters and girls playing dress-up. Their commanding officers gave them the oldest, slowest aircraft in the inventory, planes destined for scrap or agricultural work, not war. But these women had already fought their first battle just to stand beside those biplanes. They had argued with parents who forbade them to enlist. They had endured rejection from recruitment officers who laughed at the idea of female pilots. They had trained in secret, paying for flying lessons with money saved from jobs that paid them half what men earned. When the military finally opened its doors, they walked through knowing it might close again at any moment. The Po-2 was slow, fragile, and obsolete. It was also theirs. In November 1941, 3 regiments of female aviators officially entered Soviet military service. 2 would eventually transition to modern fighters and bombers. The third, the 508th Night Bomber Regiment, would fly the Po-2 for the entire war. They would conduct over 23,000 combat missions, drop more than 3,000 tons of bombs, and lose 32 pilots killed in action. German anti-aircraft batteries would learn to recognize the sound of their engines and fire blindly into darkness. Luftwaffe fighter aces would add night witch kills to their victory counts and receive Iron Crosses for shooting down women in cloth-covered trainers. But that recognition lay months ahead, beyond frozen airfields and burning cities they hadn't yet seen. In those first weeks, they were simply young women learning to coax ancient engines to life in the gathering cold, preparing for a war that had already killed millions and showed no sign of ending. Chapter 2. Learning to fly in darkness, while cities burned. The training lasted 6 months, compressed into 6 weeks. There was no time for the careful progression from theory to practice that peacetime aviation schools followed. The German army was 60 miles from Moscow. Leningrad was under siege. Stalingrad would soon become a word synonymous with annihilation. The 508th Night Bomber Regiment needed to be combat-ready before winter ended, which meant learning to fly at night over unfamiliar terrain with minimal instrumentation, navigating by stars and landmarks that German bombs were steadily erasing from the landscape. Night flying was considered one of aviation's most dangerous specialties. Even experienced male pilots avoided it when possible. The human eye struggles to judge distance in darkness. Depth perception fails. Horizons disappear. A pilot can lose all sense of up and down, spinning toward Earth while instruments insist the aircraft is level. The Po-2 offered almost no help. Its instrument panel consisted of a compass, an altimeter, and an airspeed indicator that was often inaccurate. No artificial horizon, no radio beacon. No lights inside the cockpit because any illumination would destroy the pilot's night vision and make her visible to enemy fighters. The women learned to read their instruments by moonlight and feel, memorizing the sound of the engine at different speeds, the pressure of wind against their faces, the slight tremor in the control stick that meant they were approaching a stall. They flew in pairs, a pilot and a navigator squeezed into 2 open cockpits separated by a thin wooden bulkhead. Communication between them was nearly impossible over the engine noise. They developed hand signals and learned to read each other's body language through layers of bulky flight suits. The navigator carried maps, a stopwatch, and a ruler, primitive tools for calculating wind drift and plotting courses to targets they would only glimpse in the seconds before dropping bombs. She also served as bombardier, releasing ordnance through a hole in the cockpit floor, timing the drop by counting seconds while watching landmarks slide past below. Accuracy required practice, instinct, and luck. A slight miscalculation meant bombs falling on empty fields or, worse, on Soviet positions whose coordinates had been reported incorrectly or not at all. The bombs themselves were small, rarely exceeding 100 kilograms. A single Po-2 could carry 4 at most, sometimes only 2. Male bomber crews flying modern aircraft mocked these payloads as fireworks, insufficient to destroy bridges, factories, or fortified positions. But the 588th wasn't designed for strategic bombing. Their targets were ammunition dumps, fuel depots, supply convoys, and troop concentrations, targets that couldn't move quickly and whose destruction could be achieved with precision rather than overwhelming force. A single bomb dropped accurately into a fuel truck could destroy an entire convoy. 4 bombs scattered across a supply depot could trigger chain reactions that burned for hours. The Luftwaffe had learned this lesson over British cities. Now Soviet women would teach it to German ground troops who had never imagined that ancient biplanes flown by teenagers could threaten their war machine. Now tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and how far these forgotten wartime stories have reached. Your voice helps keep memory alive. The training accidents began almost immediately. An aircraft clipped treetops during a low-altitude exercise and cartwheeled through a forest, killing both crew members instantly. Another pilot misjudged her altitude in fog and hit the ground at full throttle. Investigators found the wreckage scattered across 300 meters of frozen field. A third crew survived a crash landing, but died from exposure before search parties found them in the snow. The regiment's commander gathered the survivors and delivered a speech about acceptable losses and necessary sacrifices. The women listened in silence. That night, more than a dozen requested transfers to safer duties. Their requests were denied. The others climbed back into their cockpits and returned to the sky. Chapter 3. The First Night Over Enemy Lines. May 1942. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment received orders to deploy to the southern front near the Caucasus. German forces were advancing toward Soviet oil fields, and conventional bomber units couldn't operate effectively in the region's unpredictable weather and mountainous terrain. The Po-2's slow speed and ability to land on improvised airstrips made it ideal for the irregular harassment-style raids that Soviet commanders hoped would disrupt enemy supply lines. The women packed their belongings, loaded their aircraft, and flew south toward a war that most of them had only witnessed through radio broadcasts and propaganda films. Their first combat missions targeted a German supply depot near a river crossing. Intelligence reported fuel trucks, ammunition stores, and an artillery battery positioned to bombard Soviet defenses at dawn. The raid was scheduled for midnight, late enough that most German soldiers would be asleep, early enough that the women could return before exhaustion made the flight back too dangerous. 3 aircraft would attack in succession, each approaching from a different direction to confuse anti-aircraft defenses. The plan assumed the Germans wouldn't expect an air raid conducted by obsolete biplanes flying barely above treetop level. The lead aircraft took off first, its engine rattling into the darkness like an old motorcycle. The pilot kept her altitude under 300 meters, following a railway line toward the target zone. Behind her, the navigator crouched over maps with a small flashlight shielded by her gloved hand, checking landmarks and calculating their position. They could see nothing ahead except blackness occasionally interrupted by pinpricks of light that might be campfires, vehicle headlights, or burning buildings. The pilot's hands ached from gripping the control stick in sub-zero temperatures. Her face was numb beneath layers of cloth and leather. She flew by instinct and memory, trusting that the engine wouldn't fail, that the wings wouldn't ice over, that the night wouldn't swallow them completely. 10 kilometers from the target, she cut the engine. The sudden silence was profound. Only wind through the struts and the creaking of wood and fabric under stress. They glided forward in darkness, descending gradually, the pilot adjusting their angle by feel. Below, flashlights began sweeping the sky. Someone on the ground had heard them despite the engine shutdown. Anti-aircraft fire erupted. Not the precise radar-guided barrages that defended major cities, but panicked bursts from machine guns and rifles whose operators couldn't see what they were shooting at. Tracer rounds carved bright arcs through the night, beautiful and deadly. The pilot held her course. The navigator counted down the distance, her voice steady despite the chaos below. 30 seconds, 20 seconds, 10. The bombs fell. 4 small cylinders tumbling toward Earth, invisible until they struck fuel barrels and ignited chain reactions that turned night into day. Flames erupted across the depot, silhouetting trucks, artillery pieces, and running soldiers. The pilot restarted her engine and climbed away as explosions rippled through the supply dump, secondary detonations sending debris hundreds of meters into the air. Behind her, 2 more biplanes glided in, released their payloads, and disappeared before German defenders could organize effective countermeasures. 20 minutes after the first bomb fell, the depot was still burning. The women flew home in silence, their faces illuminated by distant firelight, knowing they had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. Chapter 4. Ghosts that searchlights couldn't hold. The Luftwaffe response came within days. Fighter patrols increased over frontline areas. Anti-aircraft batteries received orders to fire at any sound of aircraft engines after dark. German intelligence analyzed wreckage from crashed biplanes and reported their findings with confusion. These were agricultural trainers, not military bombers. Their crews were women, not men. They carried no defensive armament, no armor plating, nothing that should have allowed them to survive in modern combat zones. Yet they kept coming, night after night, attacking supply lines, troop concentrations, and forward positions with a persistence that eroded German morale more effectively than any propaganda broadcast. The women adapted their tactics with each mission. They learned to approach targets from multiple directions simultaneously, splitting German defenses and creating confusion about the true attack vector. They discovered that cutting their engines at precisely the right moment created a glide path that was nearly silent until the last seconds before impact, the sound that German soldiers began calling the night witch's broom, a whisper of wind through fabric that preceded explosions. They realized that searchlight operators struggled to track their slow-moving aircraft, often losing them in the glare or overshooting their position. Speed, which Soviet doctrine treated as essential for survival, became their enemy. Slowness became their shield. But slowness also made them vulnerable to fighters. The first Night Witch kill credited to the Luftwaffe occurred in July 1942, when a German pilot on a routine patrol spotted a Po-2 silhouetted against fires from a burning village. He approached from behind, matching his speed to the biplane's crawl, difficult in a fighter designed for high-speed intercepts. A single burst from his machine gun shredded the canvas wings. The biplane nosed over and plunged into a forest. The pilot received an Iron Cross. The Soviet regiment lost 2 women whose names appeared in casualty reports filed alongside thousands of others killed that week. More shoot-downs followed. Some German pilots found the task distasteful, comparing it to shooting birds with a rifle, but others added Night Witch symbols to their victory counts with pride. The women responded by flying lower, sometimes at altitudes of 50 meters or less where fighters couldn't follow without risking collision with terrain. They flew in worse weather, accepting the increased danger of navigation errors because fog and rain grounded enemy interceptors. They learned to use cloud cover, moonless nights, and the chaos of larger battles as camouflage. Death became part of their routine, not something they feared in advance, but something they acknowledged might happen on any flight, and then pushed from their minds during the hours of darkness when survival depended entirely on focus. The Soviet propaganda machine discovered them in autumn 1942. Newspapers published stories about heroic female aviators terrorizing the German army. Radio broadcasts featured interviews with Night Witch commanders describing their missions in terms that sanitized the fear, cold, and exhaustion. Posters depicted glamorous women in pristine uniforms standing beside modern aircraft, a fantasy that bore no resemblance to the reality of teenage pilots climbing out of open cockpits with frostbitten hands and faces blackened by engine exhaust. The real women learned to ignore the propaganda. They knew what they were. Not heroes, not symbols, but exhausted teenagers flying obsolete aircraft against an enemy that outnumbered and outgunned them in every measurable way. Their only advantage was that they refused to stop. Chapter 5. The Price of Being Allowed to Fight by 1943. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment had become one of the Soviet Air Force's most decorated units. 23 women would eventually receive the title Hero of the Soviet Union, the nation's highest military honor. Dozens more earned orders of the Red Banner and Red Star. German intelligence elevated them to priority targets. Luftwaffe commanders offered rewards for shooting them down. Soviet military leadership began recognizing their tactical value, assigning them to support major offensives at Stalingrad, the Kuban, and eventually the advance into Eastern Europe. They were no longer experimental outsiders. They had proven themselves indispensable. If this story has moved you, leave a like. It helps others discover how courage and sacrifice defined a generation of women who were told war belonged only to men. But recognition came with consequences. As their fame grew, so did the demands placed upon them. Missions increased from 8 to 15 per night, each aircraft making multiple sorties, landing only long enough to refuel, rearm, and take off again. Pilots flew until they collapsed from exhaustion. Ground crews worked around the clock repairing battle damage, patching bullet holes with fabric and glue, replacing shattered instruments with whatever spare parts they could scavenge. The women survived on 2 or 3 hours of sleep, supplemented by cigarettes, black tea, and sheer determination. Some developed tremors in their hands that made controlling the aircraft difficult. Others began hallucinating during flights, seeing phantom landmarks or believing their dead friends were flying beside them. The medical officers reported cases of what would later be recognized as combat stress. But in 1943, Soviet doctrine had no framework for treating psychological trauma. The prescription was always the same: rest when possible, fly when ordered. The casualties mounted. A pilot named Katya crashed during a storm, her aircraft disintegrating mid-air when lightning struck the fuselage. 2 others collided in darkness while returning from a mission, their aircraft spiraling down together in a tangle of wood and canvas. Another crew was shot down over German lines and captured, their fate unknown until after the war, when documents revealed they had been executed as saboteurs rather than treated as prisoners of war under Geneva Conventions that Germany selectively applied. Each death was mourned in the barracks where the women slept between missions, then filed away in operational reports that reduced their lives to statistics. Pilot killed in action, navigator missing presumed dead, aircraft destroyed beyond repair. The survivors learned to compartmentalize grief. They developed rituals, leaving a dead friend's photograph on her bunk for 3 days before packing her belongings, singing specific songs during pre-flight inspections, carrying tokens from home as protective charms. These rituals had no practical value, but they provided psychological scaffolding that allowed them to climb back into their cockpits despite knowing they might not return. Some women became fatalistic, convincing themselves their deaths were inevitable and therefore not worth fearing. Others clung to superstitions, refusing to fly on certain dates, avoiding specific aircraft that had survived too many close calls, interpreting engine troubles as omens. Both responses served the same purpose: creating an illusion of control in circumstances where control was impossible. The Soviet military leadership never acknowledged the unique psychological burden these women carried. Male pilots received regular rotations to rear areas for rest and retraining. Female pilots flew until they were killed, badly wounded, or deemed too exhausted to continue. The official explanation was practical. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment couldn't afford to lose experienced crews when training replacements took months. The unofficial reality was simpler. Soviet doctrine still didn't quite believe women belonged in combat, and their continued effectiveness was treated as an anomaly that might end at any moment. The women understood this. They had spent their entire lives proving themselves in a society that doubted them. War was simply the same struggle with higher stakes. Chapter 6. When the shooting stopped and memory began. April 1945. The war in Europe ended with artillery fire that gradually faded into silence, replaced by cautious celebrations in cities that looked like graveyards. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment flew its final combat missions over Berlin, dropping propaganda leaflets instead of bombs, a symbolic gesture that felt anticlimactic after years of night raids and constant danger. The women landed at improvised airstrips in occupied Germany, climbed out of their cockpits for the last time as combat pilots, and waited for orders that would tell them what happened to female soldiers when wars ended. Some returned home to find their families dead, their apartments occupied by strangers, their cities rebuilt without them. Others discovered that their wartime service had made them unmarriageable. Soviet society celebrated them as heroes in public, but whispered about them as unnatural women in private. Male veterans received priority for university admissions, housing, and employment. Female veterans were encouraged to return to traditional roles: factory work, teaching, nursing, anything that didn't require acknowledging they had killed enemy soldiers and watched friends die. The night witches found themselves erased from their own history, their aircraft sent to scrapyards, their stories dismissed as propaganda exaggerations. The German military that had feared them kept better records. Luftwaffe reports documented over 800 aircraft losses attributed to harassment raids by obsolete biplanes flown at night. Anti-aircraft battery logs confirmed thousands of engagements with slow-moving targets that appeared on no radar screens. Fighter pilot journals described the frustration of trying to shoot down aircraft that could turn inside their minimum turning radius and land in fields where modern fighters couldn't follow. These documents, captured by Allied forces and archived in military libraries, preserved what Soviet record-keepers chose to forget: that women flying ancient trainers had become one of the Eastern Front's most effective tactical units. For decades after the war, the Night Witches remained invisible to Western historians. Cold War politics ensured that Soviet military achievements were either ignored or attributed to male units that better fit Western assumptions about gender and combat. The women themselves rarely spoke about their experiences. Some found civilian life too confining and returned to aviation as test pilots or instructors. Others married, raised families, and kept their medals hidden in drawers alongside fading photographs. They attended reunions every few years, smaller gatherings as age and illness reduced their numbers, where they could speak openly about the cold, the fear, the friend who died beside them, the searchlights, the sound of engines that no longer existed. Marina Ruskova, who had fought for their right to fly, never lived to see victory. She died in January 1943 when her aircraft crashed during a snowstorm while leading a fighter regiment to the front. Stalin ordered a state funeral. Her ashes were interred in the Kremlin wall, the first woman granted that honor. The women of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment continued flying, carrying her memory alongside their bombs, knowing that her death had purchased their legitimacy with a price no one should have had to pay. They fought not for glory, but for the right to defend their homeland on equal terms with men who had never doubted their own belonging. Subscribe to our channel to uncover more hidden stories of World War II. Stories of resilience, memory, and the price of courage. Thank you for watching.